President Carter, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to CCTV.
It's always a pleasure, thank you.
This isn't just a potential milestone for Guyana, it's also for the Carter Center, your 100th election that your team has monitored. Can you give me a sort of assessment of how elections and election monitoring has developed in that 25, 26 years since you started this?
Well, the Carter Center initiated this process for going in from outside and offering our services to a country that has a troubled or uncertain outcome election. And we began in Panama, and then we went from there to Nicaragua, and then we've been to Indonesia, we've been to Palestine, we've been all over Africa, Latin America. And this is, as you said, the 100th time that we've held an election. The last time was in Tunisia on the northern coast of Africa. And so we offer our services. We don't interfere with the process. We have to comply with their constitution and laws and the rules that they issue themselves. We don't interfere. But we try to be helpful and try to guarantee, first of all, that the tendency or temptation to cheat is minimized because they know that we are here watching. And then we observe the election process to try to make sure it's honest and fair and safe. And then afterward, we stay here for several weeks and we analyze the process that has just been conducted and make recommendations to improve the next election.
I mean, one issue with election monitoring is you have to be invited by the government and accepted by the main political players. So presumably sometimes you're invited by a government that wants to hold a fraudulent election.
Well, that was the case in Guyana the first time. We were invited in by the opposition, who didn't think they had a chance unless we came in, and the incumbent party was very reluctant for us to come. Eventually they acceded to our request to come in and agreed with the puerile race among their own people and also with our offer to do it properly. And when they saw during election day that they were going to lose, they unleashed a lot of violence in Georgetown and around the country, and so we had to withstand that, and eventually were able to get both sides to accept the results of the election. That was in 1992, and the Indo-Guyanese who won that election have been in power ever since.
One curious thing about elections is that there's no agreed common standard for how they should be held. There's no international consensus on that. Do you think there should be?
Well, the Carter Center has made that one of our major efforts in the last 25 or 30 years. Not to prescribe to a country how they conduct an election, but to make sure that we know that all the observing groups that go in, from the United Nations to the Organization of American States to the African Union and so forth, that we basically observe the elections with the same procedures. So there's no confusion about it. And we try to accumulate international laws that are passed by different countries and find a best common denominator so that we can have standardization as much as possible for all elections, although we recognize that every individual country can write its own particular laws that relate to their way to conduct an election.
One of the other things that's happened in the last 25 years is that, particularly in this region we are now in South America, is a lot of people say that the influence of the United States is waning.
It is.
Do you regret that, and what would you suggest is done to change that?
Well, when I came into office as president, I tried to eliminate the previous American policy of supporting all the dictatorships. We would send in troops to protect the dictator from an uprising among the people who were suffering under that oppressive government. And we promoted human rights. And when I became president, there was a military dictatorship in Colombia and Peru and Ecuador and Chile, in Argentina, in Paraguay, in Uruguay, in Brazil, and some others. And within 5 or 10 years after I became president, they were all democracies. They had adopted a democratic process. Of course, they're still different from one another, but the basic principles of democracy, that is, that people choose their own leaders and can replace them if they wish, has prevailed.
But many of those countries, have within their constituents, within their electors, people who vote for an anti-American party or an anti-American stance.
That's their privilege. Yeah, that's their privilege.
Do you think the United States has lost the battle in South America? The battle of ideas, that is.
I think it's better now without the United States dominating than it was before I became president, when the United States allied itself with dictatorships and prevented the common people from changing their government procedure if they wanted to. I think it's better to have the people make their own choices, not only about their own government, but also about with whom they want to make alliances. I would say most of the countries in Central and South America and in the Caribbean are friendly toward the United States, but there are a few that are not, and that's understandable.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about China?
Sure.
It was under your presidency, of course, that diplomatic relations were restored with China in 1979, and that set off in many ways, or was concurrent with the big changes in China that have resulted in it becoming a major economic power. As you look forward for, let's say, the next 30 years, do you think the rivalry that seems inevitable between the United States and China, do you see that as a risk or an opportunity from a U.S. perspective?
Well, I don't have any doubt that China will increase its influence economically and politically in the entire global community. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. China was too long isolated, and that change that was made, openness and reform, by Deng Xiaoping was simultaneous with recognizing the United States and vice versa as diplomatic partners. And my hope since then has been that the United States and China could cooperate whenever possible. There will be some peaceful competition about who has the biggest economy, who has the fastest growing economy, and maybe even for diplomatic influence in smaller countries in Latin America and Africa and so forth. That's okay. But I think that in the strategic planning area, the United States ought to be very careful to respect China and vice versa. And we ought to take every opportunity, whenever possible, to cooperate with each other. I think, for instance, the formation of a new Chinese-dominated bank will be a beneficial thing, because a lot of more loans and grants are needed in Asia and other places in the world, and I don't think the IMF and the World Bank are adequate. So I think, although the United States subjected to that evolution, in my own personal opinion, that's probably a good thing.
You've met Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, on 4 occasions. How do you assess his leadership style, and in what direction do you think he may be taking China?
I knew Deng Xiaoping intimately and well, and respected him. He was a very powerful leader, as you know. I think that since Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping is the most powerful and authoritative and dominant leader that China has had. I think he's trying very hard to have some reforms in China, eliminating corruption and that sort of thing. I think it's too early to make a judgment about how his tenure in office will affect China internally. So far, I think it's been a very beneficial to the Chinese people to not only increase the average income for Chinese people, but to reduce the inequity that did exist between the eastern part of China and the western part of China. So in agriculture, in economy, in banking, finance, in general, I think his tenure as president so far has been beneficial.
And finally, your career, you're often seen as the sort of role model for how a retired president should behave, that sort of very exclusive group of retired American presidents. When you look back on it, if you had to choose which stage of your career were you most satisfied with, would it be the presidency or the post-presidency?
The post-presidency. It's been more enjoyable, more gratifying, and I think maybe more beneficial in the things that we try to do for other people since I left the White House. Of course, it's no comparison between the power and authority and the influence you have as president. That's obviously paramount. But as far as dealing with individual people and assessing their needs in small villages, for instance, in the desert area and in the jungle areas of Africa, we were much better able to do that. And I couldn't come into Guyana and monitor elections obviously if I was still president, but I've been here, this is the 4th time we've been here, and I've gotten to know the people and know the country as we have in a lot of other places. We've had programs in 80 different countries on earth, and my wife and I have visited more than 145 countries. So most of that was after I left the White House. So I would say that the most enjoyable and gratifying and challenging and interesting and adventurous and unpredictable part of my life has been since we left the White House.
But maybe you can only do one if you've done the other.
Well, I couldn't have the influence or access to the world leaders and other countries now if I hadn't been president first. There's no doubt about that.
President Carter, thank you so much for talking to us.
It's been a pleasure. You had some good questions, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.